Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm talking about a tank that specifically I wouldn't want to keep inside World of Tanks. It's one of those tier 9 vehicles that once you get the tier 10 you realise that it's kind of the diet version of the tank at tier 10. Now, as many of you will remember from a couple of months ago when I talked about the IS-32, that was a vehicle that I said do not sell this tank because it was clearly a tier 9 vehicle that is incredibly powerful tier for tier. As many of you will know from my Tech Tree showcase last weekend on the Italian auto-reloading heavy tanks, I feel like the Progetto 66 is also in that position, firmly a tank that I wouldn't sell because yeah, the Rinoceronte is a little bit disappointing at tier 10, there's no doubt about it. I've played a lot of games in it this week, and I'll be talking about that vehicle more in an upcoming video. So, the Stridsvagn 1030, this is the tier 9 Swedish tank destroyer, and immediately we managed to block a blind fire from the E50M. Looks like those E50Ms are cheeky players wanting to shoot into those bushes, as you probably would do if you're setting up for a camp-off on Kharkiv, this map. So, the Stridsvagn 1030, it's one of those kind of vehicles where it's just really not anything once you've managed to get the tier 10. As all of you will know, over the last few months of coverage on this channel, I'm in absolute love with the Stridsvagn 103B, the tier 10 Swedish tank destroyer. It's one of those vehicles where it doesn't matter how I'm feeling, it doesn't really matter what kind of a matchup I get into, the vehicle just seems to perform. Now, of course, a long-range Swedish sniper with armor that works against 40 or even in some places 50mm guns is going to work better inside those long-range sniping maps such as Malinovka and Prokhorovka, but for some reason, or actually I know exactly what the reason is when I think about it, you can make it work in a variety of scenarios. And a lot of that has come down to Equipment 2.0. It has revolutionized the way that you can play your Swedish tank destroyers. The turbocharger, as I said pretty much back in October or November, I really don't think that Wargaming had thought about this, or if they did they realize they were just going to flat out massively buff all of the Swedish tank destroyers? The turbocharger works by boosting the maximum speed as a flat value inside the siege mode of all of the Swedish non-turreted tank destroyers. There aren't any Swedish turreted tank destroyers, what are you talking about? So vehicles like the UDES, which I believe were limited at 5 kilometers an hour, can now go 9 forwards and I believe 8 backwards, which is just absolutely wild. And a vehicle like this, which was limited at being able to go, I believe, 8 forwards and 8 backwards, can now actually go 12 forwards, and it can also manage to, or maybe it's 11 forwards. We'll find out in this video. No, it does look like we're actually going about 12 or 13 there. But being able to go backwards at just a much greater rate is just absolutely phenomenal for this tank. In fact, I'm going to Alt F4 and I'm going to just well, not Alt F4, no, I'm not going to Alt F4 this replay. I'm going to still go in it. Actually, I just realized that this tank has the same speed as the tier 10. It's actually able to go 10 forwards and 10 backwards, meaning that with the turbo, you're going to be going 13, 14 forwards and you're going to be able to go 12 backwards. That's absolutely tremendous, and being able to boost that speed of the vehicle by pretty much about 30 or 40% inside the siege mode is absolutely wild. It allows you to pull back over the ridgeline quicker and advance over a ridgeline faster as well. And it's just truly tremendous. If you aren't using a turbo on your Swedish tank destroyers, or even if you maybe played them a while ago and you thought, man, they really aren't quite my thing because they're just not quite dynamic enough, then try and get one on your vehicles, and trust me, you are going to be more competitive than ever if you know how to use them on a ridgeline, that is. So the tier 9 is just not really the tier 10 with regards to the space protection that you have. The tier 10 tank has this heat shield, this heat guard over the front of the vehicle. And so when you do get into these kind of matchups where vehicles like the STB1 do have high explosive anti-tank rounds, playing the tier 10 just feels all that much more satisfying. Also, this vehicle has 0.3 accuracy compared to the Stridsvagn 103B, and also its predecessor, the UDES, which actually has 0.25 accuracy. And you go from being kind of a very accurate medium tank, something comparable to the E50M that we just shot on the enemy team with 0.3 accuracy, down at the tier 8 and up at the tier 10 mark as being the most accurate tank in the game. This vehicle definitely frustrates me. going back to it after, well actually, going to it after playing the UDES, and now no longer being that god tier sniper, and now going back from it having played the tier 10, I realised that the .3 accuracy on this vehicle truly does hold players back if they're used to that incredible marksmanship that you'll have on its predecessor and also its successor as well. However, the Stridsvagn 1030, as we're going to see in the game today, just because maybe it's not quite as fun as to play the tier 10, and maybe it's not as accurate as the tier 8, is still no slouch. It still has 40mm of upper hull protection and 40mm of lower hull protection, which means that you are going to be able to bounce all 120mm caliber shells off your lower plate and also off your upper plate. There are also a couple of parts, I believe, on the upper hull that do actually have 50mm of armor, namely where you see the track links on the front here and here. And so if you do get an opportunity to shoot this tank, make sure you don't shoot those parts because they are a lot thicker with the well-sloped angle armor. And so this is just the ultimate sniper's nest for a Swedish tank destroyer. But even though we've managed to pick up 2,400 damage this game and also done 1,200 spotting against the advancing STV-1 and E50M, our team is still, having the worst of it, down by 2 tanks. They've completely dominated the town, although we do have a couple of tank destroyers who are hanging on for dear life, those heavily armoured tank destroyers for which the STRV 1030 can only dream of. And oh goodness gracious, there is the bad accuracy rearing its ugly head. If I was in my tier 10 or my tier 8, I'm pretty sure we would have hit that IS-7, and with the same penetration at tier 10, almost undoubtedly gone into the hull armor. However, that was lovely. That's where the gun handling inside the siege mode for these vehicles is just absolutely tremendous. The 1.2 seconds aim time that you have and the very decent enough bloom means that you can quickly snap your shots in. Now, I wonder if I'm allowing this E50M to escape here. No, I'm not. I'm going to go into the bushes. I'm going to try and set up my binoculars here. And then I know with the sneaky shots that we've actually put into the vehicles multiple times on their approach and also away from us, that there is actually a really good opportunity to hit enemy vehicles as they go along the trench in this location. So definitely make use of that if you do end up in this sniping location. And one tank that isn't going to be sniping anymore on the enemy team is the FV4005 as we shut them down and pick up our second kill of this game. And this is just the absolute dream scenario for this vehicle. Trying to snipe it out at... Oh! Well, I obviously can't complain about the accuracy anymore, right? If we're able to hit shots like that. The dream scenario for a Swedish tank destroyer, defending a hill at decent distances against an assault of enemy tanks. And while we put 422 damage into the gorilla, I don't think it even really mattered, because the Jagdpanzer E100 towards my right just managed to absolutely club that player. So we actually track the Conway, lock them in place, and our armor against the 120mm British armament on that tier 9 British tank destroyer is unable to go through, and that's where this tank is just absolutely marvelous. If you're playing against Swedish tank destroyers, I'll try and give you a quick rundown. If you're playing against a tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, fire anything at it, you're pretty much always going to overmatch it unless you have horrific caliber gun, and there are pretty much no calibers of gun that are less than 61 around about those kind of tiers. Unless I guess you're playing the AMX 1357. That'd be a real weird instance. Have to try and recreate that one day and see if you can actually bounce off a UDES. Anyway, I'm turning this quick guide now into a very long-winded guide. So when you're playing against the tier 9, however, you have to ask yourself, do I have a 120mm caliber gun? If the answer is yes, then you can fire armor piercing at it. If you don't, then you should fire high explosive anti-tank if you have access to it, because that will penetrate up to 85 degrees of armor angling. And if you don't have that, then you should probably just fire HE and try to damage them, or even just track them and try and get their side and then lock them in place, and then they will be out the game. When you're dealing with the tier 10, however, it does become a lot more complicated, unlike this one. And that is because you have this high explosive anti-tank shield on the front of the vehicle to protect the tank from high explosive rounds, but more importantly, high explosive anti-tank rounds. So it becomes a case of, is your gun caliber 121mm? If it is, hit the lower plate of the Stridsvagn 103B. Do you have access to high explosive anti-tank rounds if your gun is less than 120mm in caliber? Well, if you do, then you should actually fire the high explosive anti-tank rounds at the lower plate of the Stridsvagn 103B, because it does have that heat shield above. However, if you do get an angle on the tank where you can avoid the heat shield, then you can fire heat rounds up to the top of the tank. Alright, so here is this Conway that shot us earlier. Decided to flank all the way round, or at least be able to use the trenches to try and get closer to us. We're going to punish the Conway for 430 as they advance. And I'm liking these rolls. 422, 436, 430. I will keep those up all day, every day with a 390 average damage gun. So back to the STRV 103B. If your gun is 150 millimeters in caliber, be careful like the T30 there. Well, unlike the T30 will have to be, because you're going to be able to avoid the shells. Well, you're not going to be able to penetrate some of the armored plating on the upper hull of the STRV 103B. But if you have a 151 millimeter caliber gun or a 155 millimeter caliber gun like that T30 there, then you can overmatch the whole of the upper plate. Alright, so in this scenario with 4.5 minutes left on the game, I feel like the enemies are surrounding us. And so now I'm going to use the hit points that we've saved up to try and punch out. This is a very important moment of the game for any sniper's nest tank. You've done the sniping work, but trust me, at this stage of the game, when the enemies figure out that they can surround you and that you're pretty dangerous up on the hill, that they are going to punish you. And this is where that turbo just allows us to chase down the Conway. Interestingly enough, the player actually shoots the weak point on top of the Swedish tank destroyer. You see hitting the commander's viewports up there. But with only losing 399 hit points, it's not the end of the world, and we can even take a hit from the T30. So I've got to think to myself now, where's the T95? Where's the Emil? Obviously the T30 will be up here, and I'm going to use the mobility that we have outside of the siege mode at 53 kilometers an hour along the flat here to hopefully be able to flank the T30. So we spot them. Yeah, don't really want to take that 155 millimeter caliber gun, but I have to act quickly, otherwise the Emil, to all intents and purposes, could be sneaking up behind us. So I'm going to pretend like I'm going up into this bush. The T30 is going to focus me. Now I have to action. I have to go into the bush as quickly as I can and boom, snap into the back of the tank. 4 kills, 5,000 damage. And the sniper is starting to venture forth and finish off these wounded tanks on the enemy team. Just what you need to do in your TDs, right? The classic tank destroyer gameplay of World of Tanks. Engage at long range and then finish them off in close quarters. And that's where the Swedish tank destroyers just feel oh so amazing, when you can actually manage to do this. So interestingly enough there, the Emil 2 manages to penetrate our lower plate. And that's because, as you can see with the hole there, we're actually sticking that lower plate up in the air, which gave the Emil a clean shot up into it. However, once we managed to get into position, you could see the Emil started to panic a little bit, realizing I can probably no longer go through the lower plate with the armor-piercing rounds that they have, or the APCR rounds, and now they'd have to actually shoot for the weak point on top of the vehicle. If the Emil 2 had loaded heat, they could have fired pretty much everywhere on the tank, because armor-piercing rounds will bounce over 70 degrees of armored surface unless they are 3 times the thickness of the armor that they hit, and that's the gun caliber that I'm talking about, i.e. 121mm caliber guns will overmatch 40mm plates. However, high explosive anti-tank rounds, believe it or not, will penetrate 85 degrees of angled armor. It was always sort of a thing. For the first few years that I played World of Tanks, I had this complete misconception, believing that armor-piercing rounds were better against angled surfaces. And they kind of are. They kind of are. Because they will normalize and they will adjust the angle in the calculation for the penetration. But they still bounce above 70 degrees angled armor, unlike high explosive anti-tank rounds, which will actually go up to 85. And while they have no normalization, which means that when the angle goes over 70, or even when it goes above 80 before it approaches 85, the amount of penetration that you'll need means that even relatively thin pieces of armor will still gain the amount of effective armor that they need to bounce the high explosive anti-tank rounds. But in cases like this, where the Swedish tank destroyers are actually incredibly well angled, but the actual thickness of the armor is not so good, yeah, it's not going to bode well for the Swedish TDs. And it's not going to bode well for the enemy team as well, as we manage to use this bush to cap the enemy circle and take down a great defense, turning it into an assault afterwards, showing you that even while I'm probably going to end up titling this video that I wouldn't keep this tank, you can still do well in it. It still has the flavor of the tier 10. But I think, considering what the matchmaker is like these days, with tier 9 tanks seeing far fewer tier 7s and far less tier 8s and more tier 9 and tier 10 tanks. If I can have that extra accuracy, if I can have that extra damage per minute, if I can have that extra armor, of course, I'm going to want to play the non-diet version of this tank. Nevertheless, this was an ace tanker for the 1,474 base experience that we earned. We get a high caliber for 5,777 damage dealt. Guess I won the slots there with 777, right? And the 5 kills doesn't quite net us a Top Gun, but we get a Confederate medal as well, meaning that we damaged at least 11 tanks on the enemy team, which is always definitely a mark that you've had a good impact. So the tier 9 Swedish tank destroyer, it's definitely one of those vehicles that I personally wouldn't keep at tier 9 once I've realized that the tier 10 is just so immensely awesome. But of course, as it's 80% of what the tier 10 is, and it's been massively buffed with the turbocharger inside the siege mode, yeah, it's probably the best time it has ever been to take your Swedish tank destroyers out onto the battlefield. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this one and you liked this snipe off that turned into a final assault. If you did, give the video a thumbs up. If you hated it, however, give it a thumbs down. And if you're watching this video as it's released on Sunday, it's time for the World of Tanks Tech Tree Showcase live right now on twitch.tv/QuickyBaby. And this week, considering that the WZ-113 GFT just became top of the tree, let's feature it. This is a bizarre vehicle. This tank is the least popular tier 10 in the game. And today I'm either going to show why or actually surprise all of you by highlighting that there are actually quite a lot of reasons to enjoy this vehicle, and there are some very nice hidden gems up the tech tree as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you live right now on twitch.tv/QuickyBaby. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.